The Gilded Serpent was New York's most private dining room for its most dangerous men, and tonight it was dead silent. A dropped fork would have cracked like a whip. Every eye was fixed on Table 1, the personal table of Kieran Thorne. He was the most feared crime boss on the entire East Coast. With a single glance, he could erase a person from existence. But right now, his power was useless. His 7-year-old daughter was letting out a terrifying, high-pitched scream that froze the entire restaurant. Nannies gave up. Psychologists were useless. 17 of them had come and gone in just 5 years. His beautiful fiancée, Vivian Ashford, was making it worse, digging her perfect nails into the little girl's arm as she tried to pull her away. That is when a waitress moved forward. She wore old canvas shoes and an apron with a burn mark. Her eyes held the deep shadow of someone who had witnessed too much pain. She did not shout. She did not plead. She did not kneel before the king of the underworld. She did something simple, something that stopped the most powerful man in the city cold and altered the course of everything. What nobody realized was that this waitress carried a secret. It was a secret tied directly to Kieran Thorne's criminal world, one that held the power to ruin them or rescue them. If you are drawn to this tale of dark love, vengeance, and a chance at a new life, please hit the like button and pass it on to a friend who loves a compelling story. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can follow what comes next. This story will show you a powerful truth. Sometimes the person who has lost everything is the only one brave enough to give everything. It is about how one napkin, one moment of courage, and one broken woman saved a broken family. Stay until the very end, because the transformation you are about to witness will restore your faith in second chances. Now, let us go back a few hours to understand the woman with the haunted eyes. But to understand what the waitress did, we must go back a few hours. We need to see who Cassandra Mora was and learn why her gaze was so haunted. Working at the Gilded Serpent was like a tense ballet, a performance mixing fear with lethal danger. For Cass, it was a typical night. She dodged unwanted touches, carried burning hot plates of overpriced food, and ignored the sneering comments from the city's powerful. She tugged at her apron, trying to conceal the worn-out fabric. She had to finish this shift. Her landlord, Mr. Novak, had been very clear. If she did not have the rent by Friday, he would throw her and her brother out onto the cold street. This was not the life Cassandra Morrow was meant for. 18 years ago, at just 10 years old, her world was completely different. Her father, Thomas Morrow, was a good cop, a rare man who would not bend to the city's criminals. On a cold winter evening, he rejected a huge payoff from a powerful gang. 3 days after that, they discovered his body in a back alley with 3 bullets in his chest. Cass could still hear her mother's shriek when the officers came to their home. She could still see her mother falling to the ground, gripping her father's coat, unwilling to release it for 3 entire days. 3 months after they buried him, her mother passed away from a heart attack. The official cause was bad health, but Cass understood what really happened. Her mother's heart had shattered. She could not exist in a world that her husband had left. In an instant, 10-year-old Cassandra was left all alone, responsible for her 1-year-old brother Theo, as they entered St. Matthew's orphanage. Life there was a nightmare. Cass shielded Theo from older kids who tried to hurt him, and from intoxicated staff who used leather belts to enforce their rules. One time they broke 2 of her ribs because she hid a piece of bread for her brother. Another time, she was thrown into a dark cellar for 3 days just for speaking up. But she never let them see her cry. She taught herself to choke back her tears, to analyze people, and to endure in a world that wished she would disappear. Now, at 28, Cass believed she had finally broken free from that torment. But destiny had another blow waiting. Theo, the brother she had defended her entire life, was diagnosed with a critical heart condition from birth. The surgery he needed would cost $250,000. Insurance refused to pay. There was no lucky break. For 8 years, Cass worked relentlessly. She held 3 jobs, serving tables during the day, scrubbing dishes at night, and sanitizing hospital rooms on weekends. She managed to save $80,000, one coin and one drop of sweat at a time. Then, 6 months ago, the man she planned to spend her life with, the one she had given everything to, disappeared with every cent. All he left was a note on her pillow. It said, "Sorry, baby. Business is business." Cass did not shed a tear when she found the note. She had lost the ability to cry years before. She just balled up the paper, tossed it away, and left for her evening job like nothing had happened. Inside, however, another piece of her spirit had crumbled. That same morning, before her shift at the Gilded Serpent, Cass had been at the hospital with Theo. He looked frail and white in the bed, but managed a weak smile for her. "Are you almost there with the money?" he asked, his voice thin. "We're so close," Cass lied, a smile on her face that did not touch her soul. "Just a bit more." She did not mention the doctor pulling her aside to say they were out of time. She did not tell him that if they did not get the money, his heart would fail within a month. She just squeezed his hand, said she would see him the next day, and left the hospital feeling the immense pressure of his life on her back. So now she stood in this underground place where murderers ate fine meals, wearing her old shoes and stained apron, observing a 7-year-old girl cry out in a way no one seemed to comprehend. She watched the stunning woman dig her nails into the child's soft arm. She saw the most dangerous man there, standing by, completely unable to help his own child. In that moment, something sparked inside Cass. 18 years spent shielding Theo had forged a single rule in her mind: act now, feel fear later. She did not consider the fallout. She did not worry about being fired. Her only focus was the suffering child, and she knew just what was needed. Cass grabbed a thick linen napkin from a server's station. She did not ask for permission. She did not make eye contact with anyone. She went right to the light controls by the kitchen and lowered the room's brightness by half. The sharp lighting immediately softened, like a fine curtain had been drawn over everything. Some diners glanced up, annoyed, but none said a word. In their world, asking questions could be a fatal mistake. Cass then proceeded straight to table 1. "Get away from her," Vivian snapped, her eyes gleaming like a viper's. "We do not need your help." Cass paid her no mind. She also disregarded the stare of Kieran Thorne, a man who could end her life with a single thought. She got down on her knees on the restaurant floor, next to the screaming, flailing girl. She made no move to touch Maisie. She said nothing to her. She just placed the linen napkin over her own head, creating a small white shelter. Then she sat quietly, her legs crossed, like someone finding peace in the center of a hurricane. Everyone in the restaurant was frozen, watching. Nobody could figure out what she was doing. Vivian's jaw dropped. She was too stunned to speak. Kieran Thorne was motionless, his gray eyes locked on the bizarre display. Then, something incredible occurred. Maisie's cries began to fade. Her struggles ceased. Her large eyes, wet with tears but free of panic, focused on the peculiar woman under the white napkin. The sheer strangeness of it all broke through her terror. Maisie's mind was no longer overwhelmed by the sound and light. It was now focused on processing this new, unexpected sight. Cass gently raised a corner of the napkin to peek out. She offered no smile and no words. She just held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. Then she dropped the napkin, vanishing again inside her little fort. Maisie blinked her eyes. The restaurant was calmer. The lighting was soft. The scary woman with the sharp fingernails was no longer so close. And on the floor was a new person, safe under a little shelter. This person was not a threat, was not yelling, and was not trying to pull her away. Maisie began to creep forward. She moved slowly, like a little kitten investigating something new. Kieran Thorne, a man who had witnessed violence, listened to pleas for mercy, and issued the most brutal commands, now found himself breathless, watching his daughter move toward a waitress. Maisie paused in front of the napkin fort. Her little hand shook as she raised the edge. Cass looked up at her. As their eyes connected, Cass spoke in a voice so low only Maisie could hear. Sometimes the world is too loud, is it not? That is okay. We are all allowed to find a hiding spot. Maisie's bottom lip quivered. She gave a small nod, a simple gesture filled with a universe of trust. I have a secret hideout, Cass whispered, lifting the napkin more. There is no noise in here. Maisie crept inside. The whole room watched as the child of the East Coast's most terrifying crime lord disappeared under a napkin with an unknown waitress. For 30 seconds. Just 30 short seconds. Two souls, the daughter of a criminal king and the most broke waitress in town, were huddled together under a piece of white linen on the floor of New York's most exclusive criminal den. The awful screaming was gone. All that remained was the sound of Maisie's soft breaths and the heavy beat of Cass's own heart. Under the cloth, Maisie gazed at Cass, her eyes still tear-stained but peaceful. She did not say a word. She did not have to. For the first time in a very long time, she felt secure. Cass carefully brought the napkin down, showing Maisie sitting quietly next to her breathing steady and her hands perfectly still. Cass got to her feet, smoothed her worn apron, and met Kieran Thorne's gaze directly. She did not lower her head, she did not shake. Her voice was steady, though her heart was hammering. She has a sensory processing disorder. The loud noise overwhelmed her hearing. The touch felt like fire on her skin. She needed a reset. Cass then faced Vivienne. The woman's beautiful face was a mask of red fury and shame. Maisie's delicate skin was still under her fingernails. Cass stared directly into her eyes and spoke with ice in her voice. And you never grab a child who is panicking. It teaches them that they must fight to be safe. Without waiting for a reply, Cass turned and walked to the kitchen. Her back was a straight line. Her pace was certain. She never looked back. The silence held for 5 more seconds. Then, from a table across the restaurant, someone started clapping. First one person, then another. Vivian's frozen glare quickly silenced the small applause. But it was too late. In front of the most powerful people in New York's underworld, a waitress with worn shoes did what countless experts could not. The balance of power at table 1 had shifted for good. Kieran Thorne could not look away from his daughter. Usually after an episode like that, Maisie would enter a catatonic state for days. She would not eat, she would not speak, she would not let anyone near her. The doctors described it as a phase of recovery. Kieran thought of it as hell, watching his daughter exist like a breathing statue, completely helpless. But this evening, Maisie was eating her pasta. She meticulously wrapped each noodle around her fork, brought it to her mouth, and chewed with care. She even gestured to a painting on the wall, whispering to the old cloth doll she never let go of. This was nothing short of a miracle. There was no other way to describe it. In 5 years, with 17 nannies and 9 psychologists, none had accomplished this. A waitress in frayed shoes did it in 30 seconds, using only a napkin. Kieran glanced over at Vivienne. She was typing furiously on her phone, desperate to contain the story before it could leak. Her perfect features were now contorted by rage. The control she valued so much had been destroyed by an unknown server in front of everyone who mattered. Kieran said nothing to Vivienne. He gestured for Pritchard, the manager, who was shaking in a corner like a field mouse cornered by a hawk. "Who is that waitress?" Kieran's voice was deep and slow, like thunder in the distance. Pritchard struggled to swallow. "A temporary hire, sir. Cassandra Morrow. She has only worked here for 3 months. I deeply apologize for her insolence. I will dismiss her at once for speaking to your guest in such a way." Kieran inclined his head toward Pritchard. It was a tiny gesture, but it was enough to make all the blood drain from the man's face. "If you fire her," Kieran said, each word a heavy stone, "I will purchase this building. Then I will throw you into the street by dawn. And you are aware I am not making a joke." Pritchard almost fell to his knees. "Yes, sir. I understand perfectly. Bring her to the private room in the back when we are done." Pritchard nodded again and again like a marionette and scurried away. The remainder of the dinner was a silent, tense affair. Vivian made several attempts to start a conversation, but Kieran ignored her. His thoughts were somewhere else, on the kitchen door the waitress had vanished through, on the eyes that did not waver when they met his own. He thought of how she spoke to Maisie like she was a person, not an issue that needed fixing. 45 minutes later, Kieran was alone in the private room. Vivian had taken Maisie home, and he could feel her silent rage. He did not care. He had more pressing concerns. The door swung open. Cassandra Morrow entered. She did not lower her head. She did not shrink away. She stood tall, her shoulders back, looking at him as if he were any other man in any other restaurant. "Sit down," Kieran commanded, gesturing to the opposite chair. Cass sat. She placed her hands on her legs. They were still. She waited. "Do you know my identity?" Kieran asked. "I do. And you still have the nerve to meet my gaze? Would you rather I looked at the wall?" Kieran almost smiled. It had been a long time since anyone dared speak to him that way. "What is your knowledge of sensory processing disorder?" he asked, ignoring her question. "I know enough to see it." "From where?" Cass paused for a moment. "My brother. He showed similar signs when he was a boy. I learned how to help him." "How is your brother today?" "He is in the hospital. He has a heart condition." Kieran nodded, storing that piece of information. "You are not afraid of me." It was not a question. It was a fact. Cass held his iron-gray gaze. "I have seen things far more terrifying than you, Mr. Thorne." She then stopped, as if she realized the weight of her words. "I am sorry. That was not what I meant." "It is true," Kieran cut in, his tone holding a strange new quality. "Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was respect. You are the first person in 5 years who has looked me in the eye without shaking." Cass remained silent. She just sat there waiting, as if she had endless time to spare while facing the most feared killer on the entire East Coast. Kieran watched her a moment more. He noted the frayed canvas shoes, the faded apron, the eyes that held the shadows of a person who had seen too much pain. But he saw no weakness there, only survival, only strength. "I have an offer for you," Kieran finally said, "but it will not be tonight. Someone will be in touch." Cass got to her feet. "May I leave now?" "You may." She walked to the door, but she paused just before opening it. "Your daughter," Cass said, her back still to him. "She is not broken. She simply feels the world in a different way. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." Then she was gone, leaving Kieran Thorne by himself in the room, feeling a tiny spark of light for the first time in his long, dark years. 3 days after their encounter at the Gilded Serpent, Kieran Thorne was in his office at Thorne Tower. It was the skyscraper he owned in the center of Manhattan. From the 63rd floor, the city below looked like a massive game board. But he was not looking out the window today. He was focused on the thick file on his desk. Declan Byrne, his most trusted lieutenant, stood before him. This was the man who had been with Kieran from the beginning of his empire, who had ended lives for him, who had nearly died for him, and who was one of the very few people Kieran had complete faith in. "This is everything we could find on her, boss," Declan reported in a quiet, firm voice. Kieran opened the file. A photograph of Cassandra Morrow was on the first page. It was not a formal employee picture, but a candid image of her leaving a hospital. Her shoulders were slumped from weariness, but her stride was still determined. He started to read. With every page he turned, his expression became colder. Not from anger, but from an emotion he thought he could no longer feel. Father. Thomas Morrow, a police officer, was killed when Cassandra was 10. The official report called it an unsolved case. But Kieran knew what really happened. He knew exactly who was responsible for that murder. Salvatore Vega. The name made Kieran's jaw tighten. Vega was his primary rival in the city's underworld. He was the serpent who had tried to destroy the Thorne Empire many times. And 18 years ago, Vega had ordered the death of an honest policeman who refused to take a bribe. That policeman was Cassandra's father. Kieran continued to read. Mother. Sarah Morrow died from a heart attack 3 months after her husband was killed. Her childhood was spent at St. Matthew's Orphanage. The records mention several violent incidents without giving any details. Medical charts showed Cassandra Morrow was brought to the hospital 3 times in 7 years there for different injuries: broken ribs, deep bruising, and a minor head injury. Kieran had witnessed many awful things in his life. He had personally done many awful things. But as he read about a 10-year-old orphan being beaten, a cold rage began to build inside him. Her current situation, working 3 jobs, 2 months behind on her rent, her bank account nearly empty. She had been scammed out of $80,000 by a man named Marcus Webb, who had since vanished. Kieran committed the name to memory. Marcus Webb would not be missing for much longer. He then moved to the section on Theo Morrow. Her brother, 19 years old, was a second-year computer engineering student at Columbia University on a full scholarship. His grade point average was 3.9. He had a congenital heart defect. He needed an urgent operation that cost $250,000. He was at Brooklyn General. His health was failing daily. And on the final page, there was a photograph. Cassandra was at Theo's bedside in the hospital. She held her brother's hand and had a small smile on her face, but her eyes were dark with exhaustion. Her brother was frail and pale, yet he looked at her with pure trust. Kieran looked at the image for a very long time. He thought about Maisie and how his own daughter looked at the strange waitress with that very same trust. He thought about the miracle that occurred in just 30 seconds. She is clean, boss, Declan confirmed. No connections to any crew, no police record, no secret agenda. She is just a girl who has had a very difficult life and is still fighting. Kieran shut the file. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing at the sparkling city below. Cassandra Morrow's father was taken from her by the world he ruled. She grew up with violence and suffering. She had every right to despise men like him, and yet, she went to the Gilded Serpent every day, serving powerful men she must have hated, just to earn money to save her brother. It was pure survival. Kieran respected that. Arrange a meeting, he said, his eyes still on the city. Declan, bring her to me. I have an offer she cannot refuse. 2 days later, Cassandra Morrow was in the lobby of Thorn Tower. She fought the urge to stare like a small-town girl seeing the city for the first time. An unknown number had called her the night before. A cold, low voice spoke a single command. Mr. Thorne wants to see you. A car will be there at 10 in the morning. Then the line went dead. There was no room to say no. And now here she was, inside a skyscraper she had only ever seen in magazines. The lobby chandelier alone was worth more than a lifetime of her wages. A man in a dark suit led her to a private elevator, which soared to the 63rd floor. When the doors opened, Cass entered the penthouse and fought to keep the shock from her face. This single apartment was bigger than her entire building. Windows from floor to ceiling showed a panoramic view of Manhattan. The furniture was minimal, but every item screamed of impossible wealth. An abstract painting on one wall was likely worth more than Theo's entire surgery. Kieran Thorne had his back to her, looking out the window. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up. It revealed a powerful forearm, marked by a long scar from his wrist to his elbow. He turned, and his gray eyes scanned her as if she were a business deal needing assessment. Sit, he said, motioning to a black leather sofa. Cass sat with her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. She held his gaze. I will be direct, Kieran said, taking the seat across from her. I am making you a proposal. Hear all of it before you answer. Cass nodded and waited. My daughter Maisie needs a person who can understand her. I have hired 17 nannies in 5 years. Every one of them quit. I hired 9 psychologists with degrees longer than my arm. None of them accomplished what you did in 30 seconds at that restaurant. She stayed quiet, just listening. I want to hire you as Maisie's live-in nanny. The salary is $20,000 a month. All of your living costs will be covered. You will have your own room, a car, and anything else you require. Cass felt like the air had been stolen from her lungs. $20,000 a month was more than 10 times what she made working 3 jobs. But she understood that nothing was free, especially from a man like him. "What is the condition?" she asked plainly. Kieran looked at her, and a flicker of something crossed his eyes. It might have been respect that she was not a fool. "I will cover the full $250,000 cost for your brother's surgery. The money will be sent to the hospital tomorrow if you accept." For a moment, the world stopped for Cass. She could not breathe or think. $250,000. Theo's life, offered to her like pocket change. "Why?" she asked, her voice tight. "You have no idea who I am. You do not owe me anything. Why would you do this?" "Because no one in 5 years has treated my daughter like a normal child. They all viewed her as a problem to fix, as something that was broken. You were the first to sit on the floor with her and tell her it was okay to hide." Kieran rose and walked back to the window. "I am not a good man, Cassandra. I have done things that would make you sick, but I will pay any price for Maisie." Cass stared at his silhouette, her mind racing. "But there is more, is there not?" she said. "You mentioned conditions." Kieran turned around. For the first time, she saw what looked like hesitation on his face. "My world demands certain appearances," he said slowly. "My council is made of old men who think power requires a stable family. They are pushing me to marry Vivian Ashford to secure an alliance, but I do not trust her. I have seen things that make me suspicious." Cass waited for him to continue. "I need time to look into Vivian without anyone knowing. To do that, I need an excuse to avoid marrying her." He looked directly at Cass. "To the council and to the world, you will be my wife." "What?" Cass shot up from the sofa. "A paper marriage. It would not be real. You will have your own bedroom and your own life. I will not touch you unless you want me to. But to everyone else, you will be Mrs. Thorne." "You are crazy," Cass said, taking a step back. "I cannot play the part of a mob boss's wife. I do not belong in your world." "6 months," Kieran stated. "Only 6 months. After that, if you still want to leave, you will have enough money to build a new life anywhere you choose. $1 million on top of your salary. You and your brother would never have to worry about money again." Cass paced back and forth. This was insane. It was completely insane. She could not do this. Her own father was killed by the mob. She promised herself she would never get involved in that world. But then she pictured Theo. She saw the hope in his eyes every day. She heard the doctor's voice saying they were out of time. She heard the beep of the heart monitor, a constant clock ticking down. "What happens if someone learns the truth?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I will protect you," Kieran said, moving closer. "No one is permitted to hurt what belongs to me. Once you sign that contract, you belong to me." Cass looked into his steel-gray eyes. She thought about her father, who died because he refused to bend to men like this. She thought of her mother, who died from a broken heart. And she thought of Theo, who was waiting for a miracle she could not provide on her own. Sometimes, saving the people you love means walking straight into hell. "Fine," Cass said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I accept." 3 days after she signed the agreement, Cassandra Morrow arrived at Thorn Tower with one small suitcase holding all her possessions. The suitcase looked pitiful in the middle of a bedroom that was 3 times the size of her old apartment. Her new room was in the penthouse's east wing. It had glass walls that overlooked the Hudson River. It had a private bathroom with a marble tub bigger than her old bed. And it had a walk-in closet that was completely empty, waiting to be filled. Cass opened her suitcase, looked at her few worn-out clothes, and laughed without humor. Everything she owned could fit in a single drawer with room to spare. A maid knocked, introduced herself as Helena, and asked if she needed help with anything. Cass had no idea what to say. She had never had a maid, She had never used a sink with gold faucets. She had never slept on sheets made of thousand-count Egyptian silk. She thanked Helena and said she was fine. Then she shut the door and sat on the bed, just trying to catch her breath. She was here. She was in the lion's den, and there was no going back. Later that afternoon, Declan showed her around the penthouse. The home had 12 rooms. This included a private gym, a small movie theater, a library holding thousands of books, and a rooftop garden with a pool that overlooked all of Manhattan. Maisie's room was in the west wing, separated from hers by a very long hallway. Declan paused in front of a white door that had flowers painted on it by hand. "She is in there," he said in a low voice. "She does not like strangers. She does not like loud noises. She does not like to be touched. Most of the time she will act like you are not even here." Cass nodded. "I know the boss expects a lot from you." Declan's dark eyes were impossible to read. Do not disappoint him. He walked away, leaving Cass alone in front of the white door. She took a deep breath before she gently pushed it open. Maisie's room looked like a page from a fairy tale. The walls were a soft blue with white clouds painted on them. The bed was shaped like a castle, and shelves were full of picture books and dolls. But Maisie was not in her bed or sitting in a chair. She was huddled in the darkest corner of the room, clutching an old doll and staring at nothing. Cass did not say a word. She did not say hello or try to get closer. She just walked to the opposite corner of the room, about 15 feet away. She sat on the floor, took a ball of yarn and 2 knitting needles from her bag, and began to knit. The first stitch, the second, the third. The quiet clicking of the needles was a soft, steady rhythm in the silent room. Cass did not look at Maisie or wait for any kind of response. She just knitted, as if it was the most ordinary thing to do. 18 years of looking after Theo had taught her one thing. Wounded children do not need someone rushing in with big promises and forced smiles. They have been let down too many times to trust so easily. They need someone who is patient enough to wait, someone wise enough not to push, and someone steady enough to prove they are not going to leave. So Cass did not speak to Maisie on the first day. She simply sat and knitted in her corner from 3 in the afternoon until 6 in the evening, when a maid came to get Maisie for dinner. The little girl got up without ever looking at Cass and left as if the room had been empty. Cass was not discouraged. She knew this would be a long fight. She had already been through hell. She could be patient. On the second day, Cass did the same thing. She sat in the same spot and knitted. Maisie did not acknowledge her. The third day passed in the same way. On the fourth day, Cass saw that Maisie had shifted a little bit closer. It was only a foot or two, but it was enough. The plan was working. On the fifth day, Cass intentionally let her ball of yarn drop. It rolled across the floor and came to a stop right by Maisie's feet. The girl looked down at the yarn, then up at Cass, and then back at the yarn. A minute went by. Then 2. Finally, Maisie leaned over, picked up the yarn, and carried it back to Cass. "Thank you," Cass said gently, careful not to look straight into her eyes. "Do you want to learn how to knit?" Maisie did not reply, but she sat down on the floor right next to Cass. That was the beginning. The second week delivered a change that Cass had only dreamed of. After their first day sitting together, Maisie started coming to the playroom earlier each afternoon. It was almost like she was waiting. Cass maintained her routine. She would enter, settle in her corner, pull out her yarn, and start knitting. She never pushed Maisie to speak. She did not ask about her health, her sleep, or her meals, the way other nannies must have. Cass was just a constant presence, a steady light in the child's darkness. On the 9th day, Maisie brought a box of colored pencils and clean white paper into the room. She abandoned her usual dark corner. Instead, she sat about a meter away from Cass, arranged the paper on the floor, and began to draw. Cass never glanced at the girl's work. She knew that any direct attention could send Maisie retreating into her shell. She continued to knit, giving the girl space while remaining close enough to be a comfort. For hours, they sat in that shared silence. The only sounds were the scratching of pencils and the soft click of knitting needles. There was no music and no conversation, just the quiet company of two souls learning to build trust. On the 11th day, Cass was struggling with a complicated stitch. She had to pause and pull out a row of yarn. That was when she heard soft footsteps approach. She lifted her head to see Maisie standing before her. The child held a drawing with both hands, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. Cass stayed quiet. She simply waited. Without looking up, Maisie offered the paper to her. Cass accepted the drawing gently. It was a crayon sketch, drawn with a child's simple hand, but its message was painfully clear. Two stick figures stood together. One was tall with long black hair. The other was small with curly black hair. A large blue umbrella shielded them from above. A red dragon breathed fire down at them, but the flames could not penetrate the shield. The umbrella kept them safe. A lump formed in Cass's throat. She knew precisely what the picture represented. The dragon was the frightening world outside, with its loud noises, bright lights, and grasping hands. The umbrella was the napkin tent. It was safety. It was a place the noise could not enter. Cass pointed to the two figures. "Who is this?" she asked softly, even though she already knew the answer. Maisie remained quiet for a very long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, so faint Cass had to lean in. "Me," she said, touching the smaller figure. Then she moved her finger to the taller one. "Sister." The word felt like a blade of pure joy piercing Cass's heart. It was the first time Maisie had given her a name. Not a title, not a job description. Sister. "I love this drawing," Cass said, her voice shaking just a little. "Can I keep it?" Maisie gave a small nod before going back to her spot to draw again. But this time, she sat closer. Their shoulders were almost touching. Cass understood she had broken through a barrier that had stood for 5 years. She did not realize that someone was watching from the doorway. Kieran Thorne had returned home from work early. He was headed to his study when he paused outside Maisie's playroom. He stood unseen, observing through the gap in the door. He saw his daughter, a child who had spoken only to her doll for 2 years, give a drawing to a stranger. He heard the word sister come from lips that had not spoken to another living person in so long. Something deep inside his chest, a part of him he thought had died with Elena, started to flicker back to life. After that day, Kieran Thorne started coming home earlier. He stopped working until midnight. He stopped eating dinner alone in his study. He began arriving at 6 in the evening and would join Maisie and Cass at the dining table. The first few meals were quiet. Kieran did not know how to talk to his daughter. Maisie was not accustomed to her father's presence. But Cass was there, a silent connection between them, and the awkwardness slowly faded. One night during dinner, Maisie suddenly pointed toward the window. "I see a bird," she said to Kieran. Just 3 words. But for Kieran Thorne, they were more significant than any business deal, more triumphant than any victory in his dark world. His daughter had spoken to him. He looked up and his eyes met Cass's across the table. He saw her smile, a small, knowing smile. It was as if she understood the true weight of that moment. Kieran Thorne, the ruthless and cold-hearted Mafia boss, felt his heart skip a beat. The story spread like a plague. Kieran Thorne, the most feared man on the East Coast, had broken his engagement to Vivian Ashford. Just 2 weeks later, he secretly married an unknown waitress. The tabloids ran grainy pictures of Cass walking into Thorne Tower. Rumors exploded across social media. They said she was a seductress. They said she was carrying his child. They said anything but the truth. Inside a lavish penthouse on the Upper East Side, Vivian Ashford destroyed a $50,000 set of Chinese porcelain. "That waitress!" she shrieked, throwing an ancient vase against the wall. The sound of it shattering was deafening. "He chose a waitress over me." Rhett Calloway, a tall man in a dark suit, stood perfectly still in the corner. He did not react to her fury. He had seen her tantrums before. He knew her anger was not about rejection. It was about the failure of a 3-year operation. "Calm yourself, Tessa," Rhett said, using her real name. Vivian Ashford spun around, her green eyes blazing with a dangerous light. But she did not protest him using her true name. In this room, there was no need for pretend identities. Vivian Ashford did not exist. She was a fiction, created 10 years ago with perfect forgeries, a made-up family tree, and a respectable Boston history that no one had ever questioned. The woman in the room was Tessa Brennan. She was a professional grifter who had charmed and destroyed 5 wealthy men before she targeted Kieran. And she was not working alone. Her employer was Salvatore Vega, Kieran Thorne's greatest enemy. The mission had been straightforward. Tessa would marry Kieran, earn his absolute trust, and then leak inside information. Vega would use it to dismantle the Thorne empire from the inside out. Kieran's death was meant to be the final step, after all of his wealth was signed over to Tessa. But a simple waitress in worn-out shoes had destroyed everything in a single night. "The mission is not over," Rhett said calmly. "Vega still wants Thorne eliminated. We will simply change our methods." Tessa stood among the broken porcelain, her breathing heavy. But her mind was already calculating. She was not a fool. She had not made it this far by letting her emotions control her. "That waitress," Tessa said, her voice turning to ice. "I want to know everything about her. Find her weakness. Find something we can exploit." Rhett nodded. His investigation had already begun the day before. 2 weeks later, Cass was informed she would be attending a charity gala as Mrs. Thorne. Kieran had a stylist bring dozens of designer gowns to the penthouse for her. Cass looked at her reflection in the mirror. She was wearing an elegant black dress that cost more than 5 months of her former wages. She could not recognize the woman staring back at her. At the event, Cass felt like a minnow in a shark tank. Women dripping with diamonds gave her condescending looks from behind fake smiles. Men in tailored suits watched her with a mix of curiosity and distrust. She was an outsider. She did not fit in this world, and they all knew it. Kieran remained at her side for most of the night. His hand rested lightly on her back, a silent, protective gesture. But he occasionally had to speak with business associates, leaving Cass alone near the champagne. That is when Vivian made her move. She came up behind Cass, a vision in a tight red dress and golden hair, with a smile that was pure poison. "Ah, the new Mrs. Thorne," Vivian cooed, her words sharp as glass. "Or should I say Cassandra, the little waitress?" Cass stood her ground. She had dealt with people far scarier than a beautiful woman with a phony smile. "You can call me Cass. We do not need to pretend to be friends." Vivian's head tilted, her green eyes like chips of ice. "Interesting. You do realize you are playing with fire. Kieran Thorne's world is no place for a fragile girl who used to carry dinner plates." "I have survived things you could not even imagine, Miss Ashford," Cass answered with calm certainty. "Do not worry about me." Vivian moved in closer. Her breath was a warm whisper against Cass's ear. "I know about your brother," she murmured. "Theo, is it not? At Brooklyn General. He has surgery scheduled. It would be such a shame if an accident happened before then." Cass froze. The blood in her veins turned to ice. "If you so much as touch Theo—" "Oh, I will not have to do a thing," Vivian said with a light laugh, stepping away to sip her champagne. "I just need you to. You don't belong here. Eventually, Kieran will see that. And when he does, you are going to lose everything. Not just this sham of a marriage, but everything you are trying so hard to protect." Then Vivian turned and vanished into the party, as if she had never spoken at all. Cass was left alone, her heart pounding and her hands shaking with rage. But beneath the fear, a different fire started to burn. It was suspicion. Something was fundamentally wrong with Vivian Ashford. The way she spoke, how she knew about Theo, the way she looked at Cass like a piece in a game. Cass knew then that she would find the truth, no matter what it cost her. After the gala, sleep was impossible. Cass lay on the silk sheets, staring into the blackness of the room, her mind racing with Vivian's threat. She thought of Theo. She thought of all she stood to lose. At around 1 in the morning, she finally gave up and went to the kitchen for some water. She never expected to find Kieran there. He was at the bar by himself with a glass of whiskey, looking out the massive window at the city lights, which sparkled like a carpet of fallen stars. He wore a simple black shirt, not his usual suit. The sleeves were rolled up and the collar was open. He looked tired. For the first time, he seemed less like a mafia boss and more like a regular man. "Can't sleep?" Kieran asked. He did not turn around, as if he already sensed her presence. Cass paused for a moment before walking over and sitting a stool away from him. "No." "You?" "I don't sleep much," he said. "I have not for a long time." Silence fell between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people who were too worn out to wear their masks. Kieran poured another glass of whiskey and pushed it toward Cass. She took a sip and felt the liquid burn a warm path down her throat. "What did Vivian say to you tonight?" Kieran asked without warning. Cass was not surprised he knew. He had eyes everywhere. "She threatened Theo," Cass said. "She knows that my brother is in the hospital." Kieran's jaw went rigid. "I will handle her." "I know," Cass said. "But I need to know who she really is. There is something off about her. Do you not feel it?" Kieran was silent for a long moment before he nodded. "I have suspected it for some time, but I lack any real proof." They drank their whiskey in silence until Kieran spoke again. "Elena did not like alcohol." Cass looked at him, surprised. No one in the house ever dared to mention his late wife's name. "She preferred chamomile tea," Kieran went on, his gray eyes distant. "Every night she would make a pot, sit near the window, and read a book. She said it was her way to find peace at the end of the day." He stopped, swallowing hard. "She died when Maisie was born. Complications after the birth. The doctor said they tried everything, but it was not enough." His voice was heavy with old pain. "I was right there with her. I held her hand as she took her final breath, and she made me promise to take care of our daughter." He gave a sharp, bitter laugh. "And look at the job I have done. My daughter would not even speak to me for 2 years. She was afraid of me. She was afraid of everyone." Cass did not know how to respond. She simply listened. "Sometimes that is all a person needs." "And what about you?" Kieran asked, finally turning to face her. "What is your story of survival?" Cass looked into her glass. She had never spoken of her years at the orphanage. It was not from shame. It was because no one had ever bothered to ask. "St. Matthew's Orphanage," she started, her voice soft. "I was there from when I was 10 until I was 17. The older children always picked on Theo because he was so small. I had to fight a lot to keep him safe." She pushed up her sleeve, showing a pale scar on her forearm. "The supervisor liked to use his belt. I took the beatings for Theo most of the time. One time, they locked me in the basement for 3 days just for hiding some bread." Kieran stared at the scar, then met her eyes. In his cold gaze, Cass saw something she did not expect. It was not pity, it was understanding, respect, and a flicker of rage directed not at her, but at the people who had hurt her. Before he could say anything, a scream tore through the house from Maisie's room. They both ran. Maisie was sitting up in her bed, her eyes wide with terror from a nightmare. Cass acted instantly. She pulled a linen napkin from her nightgown pocket and sat next to the bed. "Tent time," she whispered, and began to build a small shelter. Maisie slowly calmed down and crawled under the cloth, curling up beside Cass. Kieran stood in the doorway, completely lost. "Come in," Cass said softly, holding the napkin tent open. "There is room for 3. Kieran hesitated. The most feared man on the East Coast, a killer who made the city tremble, was unsure about crawling under a napkin. Then, he sat on the floor and joined them inside. 3 people were huddled together under the cloth. Maisie was in the middle, her head on Cass's shoulder, her small hand holding Kieran's finger. Darkness surrounded them, but for once, it felt safe. "This is the strangest thing I have ever done," Kieran whispered. You will get used to it, Cass replied, a small smile on her face. A moment passed. Then Kieran spoke again, his voice low. I do not think I will ever get used to you, Cassandra. And in the dark, Cass's heart skipped a beat. After that night, things started to shift. Cass no longer saw Kieran as just a terrifying monster. She saw a man who had lost his wife and had no idea how to be a father to his daughter. She saw him trying, awkwardly and imperfectly, but he was trying. But she pushed those thoughts aside. She had a more urgent mission. Vivian Ashford. In the weeks that followed, Cass paid attention. She noticed things she had missed before. She heard Vivian speaking Spanish on the phone when she believed she was alone. She saw the way Vivian watched Kieran, not with love, but with the cold calculation of a predator. She also observed the meetings between Vivian and Rhett Calloway, the bodyguard Kieran hired 3 years ago. They always stood a little too close. They whispered secrets Cass could not hear. Whenever she met their gaze, a cold feeling washed over her. She started a log, writing down dates, times, and places. She recorded fragments of conversations and suspicious actions. She was not sure what she was looking for, but the instincts that had kept her alive for 18 years were screaming that something was terribly wrong. Then one night, the pieces clicked into place. Cass woke up at 2 in the morning, needing a drink of water. As she passed the hall near Kieran's office, she saw a sliver of light from under the door. Kieran was in Chicago on business. He was not due back until the morning. Who would be in his office at this hour? Holding her breath, Cass pressed her body against the wall and peered through the crack in the door. Rhett Calloway was at Kieran's desk. He held a phone in his hand, taking pictures of documents, page by page. He worked quickly, with a professional calm that suggested he had done this before. He photographed each page and placed it back exactly where it had been. He left no sign of his intrusion. Cass pulled back from the door without a sound, her heart beating like a drum. She ran back to her room, locked the door, and sat on her bed, her body trembling. She had been right all along. There was a traitor in the house. And if Rhett was the traitor, who was he working for? The answer came to her like a strike of lightning. Vivian. The next morning, the moment Kieran got home, Cass insisted they speak in private. They went to the library, which Kieran swept for any listening devices. Cass told him everything. Her suspicions about Vivian, the secret meetings with Rhett, and exactly what she had witnessed in his office the night before. When she was done, Kieran's face was unreadable, but Cass saw the muscle tighten in his jaw and his hands clench into fists at his sides. Are you certain? He asked, his voice low and deadly. I saw it myself, Cass said. He took pictures of at least 20 pages. Kieran stood up and walked to the window, his back facing her. The silence grew heavy. Cass knew he was calculating, planning who was about to die. I want him dead now, Kieran said, his voice cold as ice. But if you do that, Cass countered, we will never find out who he works for, and we will never know Vivian's true identity. Kieran turned around. His gray eyes held a look of surprise and respect. You think like a strategist. I survived hell, Cass replied. You pick things up. Kieran gave a slow nod. So what do you suggest? We act like we know nothing. Let Rhett believe he is still safe. In the meantime, have your man Declan investigate Vivian. Dig into her past. Find out where she came from, what she did before she met you, and who she is really working for. Kieran watched her for a long moment. Then, the corner of his mouth lifted in something that was almost a smile. You know, Cassandra, when I hired you, I did not expect a strategic advisor. Life is full of surprises, Cass said. And with that, they became partners in a war against an enemy who was still hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to attack. 2 weeks after their talk in the library, Declan returned with news. It was what Kieran had suspected, but hearing it confirmed still made his jaw clench. They sat in Kieran's office with the door locked. Declan put a thin file on the desk. It was suspiciously thin. Vivian Ashford did not exist before 10 years ago, Declan said. There is no birth certificate, no school records, no medical history. Before that, she is a ghost. It was 2015. The documents were flawless forgeries, the kind that required a powerful organization. Kieran stared at the file. It held only a few sheets of paper, but they proved the woman he nearly married was a ghost. He asked for her real name. Declan did not know. But he had traced the photos Rhett sent from Kieran's office. They went to a disposable phone inside Salvatore Vega's territory. The name dropped the temperature in the room. Vega was the enemy Kieran had hunted for 10 years. He was the man who had murdered Cassandra's father, and for 3 years, Vega had a spy living in Kieran's own house. Kieran ordered the investigation to continue. He needed her true name. He needed to know what Vega was planning, but the enemy knew they were closing in. That afternoon, Cass took Maisie to Central Park. It was the first time the child had agreed to leave the apartment since Cass arrived. It was a small beginning. Maisie held Cass's hand while they walked under the trees. 2 bodyguards stayed at a distance, near enough to help but far enough to give them space. They found a stone bench near the water. Maisie sat quietly, watching the ducks. Then Cass saw it. A real smile, just a small upturn of her lips. The girl softly said she liked the blue duck. Cass agreed, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. They stayed for 10 more minutes, enjoying the quiet moment. Then Cass checked the time and said they should head back. They stood and walked to the park's exit, with the guards behind them. Everything was normal until they stepped into the street to reach their car. Cass heard the engine first, a furious roar. A black car without license plates was speeding right for them. Her instincts took over before she could think. She grabbed Maisie, pulled her into her chest, and dove to the side. They landed hard on the sidewalk. The car sped past them, missing by less than a foot. The force of the wind whipped Cass's hair. Brakes screamed. People shouted. The bodyguards drew their guns, but the vehicle disappeared into the flow of traffic. Cass trembled on the pavement, holding Maisie. The little girl was crying, but she made no sound. Her silent tears were a terrible sign of progress. She had learned to suffer fear without breaking down. "It is okay," Cass whispered, her own heart pounding. "I am here. You are safe." One guard was on the phone with Kieran. The other scanned the area for new dangers. Lying on the cold concrete, Cass understood the awful truth. This was not a random accident. It was a clear warning. Someone knew they were investigating. Someone wanted them to know they could be hurt at any time. Someone wanted them to be afraid. 20 minutes later, Kieran exploded into the penthouse living room. He saw Cass and Maisie on the sofa under a blanket, and his rage vanished. He knelt and checked Maisie from head to toe. Then he checked Cass. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "Just a scraped knee," Cass said. "Maisie is fine." Kieran closed his eyes, holding back something powerful. When he opened them again, Cass saw an emotion she had never seen in his steel eyes. It was fear, but not for himself. It was for them. "From this moment on," Kieran said, his voice cold, "you and Maisie will not leave Thorn Tower unless I am with you. This is an order." Cass wanted to argue that she did not need a keeper, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He held her hand like she might disappear. She just nodded. The war was here. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Thorn Tower became a fortress. The number of guards tripled. Every door was watched 24 hours a day. Cass was now a prisoner inside beautiful glass walls. She did not fight it. She knew it was necessary, but the feeling of being trapped was suffocating. It brought back memories of being locked in the dark. Maisie felt the change and clung to Cass. The little girl would not sleep alone and asked for the napkin tent every single night. Cass always said yes. She knew that kind of fear because she felt it too. A week after the attack, a soft knock came at her door near midnight. She opened it and found Kieran. He was still in his work clothes, his tie pulled loose. His hair was messy, as if he had been running his hands through it. "Have you slept?" he asked her quietly. "Not yet," Cass told him. "I have not been sleeping much lately." Kieran nodded like he understood. He asked if he could come in. Cass paused, then moved aside too. His eyes were softer and warmer, full of feelings he seemed unable to process. "Are you okay?" he asked. Cass insisted she was fine, but her voice shook. "I just keep thinking what would have happened if I had been a second too late. If Maisie—" She could not say the words. She did not have to. Kieran moved toward her. He reached out, paused, and then wrapped his hand around hers. His skin was rough from years of fighting, yet his touch was surprisingly soft. "You saved my daughter," Kieran said, his voice thick with emotion. "You used your body as a shield for her. Do you understand what that means to me?" Cass met his gaze. In that instant, the walls between them disappeared. The bedroom door creaked open. Maisie stood in the doorway, clutching a doll. Her eyes were red from a bad dream. "Mommy," she whispered. Cass and Kieran both went still. "Mommy." Maisie had just called Cass Mommy. Not her sister, not her nanny, her mother. The word hit Cass like a physical blow. She pulled her hand from Kieran's, knelt down, and wiped the tears from her own eyes. She opened her arms wide. Maisie rushed forward, clinging to Cass's neck like she might vanish. "I dreamed about the car," Maisie whispered. "I was afraid you got hurt." "I am here," Cass said, the words feeling natural and true. "I am okay. You are safe now." She carried Maisie to her bed and they built the napkin tent together. Maisie curled up next to Cass and was asleep in under 10 minutes. When Cass went back to her room, Kieran was still there. He was watching her with a look she had never seen. It was not the look of a crime boss or a pretend husband. It was the look of a man seeing the woman he desired. "You know," Kieran said softly, "that was the first time in 7 years Maisie has called anyone mommy." Cass backed away until she felt the wall against her shoulders. "Kieran, you changed it all," he said. "You came into our world with a simple napkin and turned everything upside down, and I do not know what to do about it." He was so close she could feel his breath, close enough to see tiny scars on his face she had never seen before. Cass whispered his name, Kieran, without knowing what would follow. He bent down and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had held back for too long, who had been alone for too long. He had lost so much and was terrified of losing more. His mouth was hot and demanding, but she could feel a strange vulnerability beneath the pressure. In a moment of weakness, Cass kissed him back. She let herself feel wanted, needed, and finally seen. Then, reason crashed over her like a cold wave. She pressed lightly on his chest and created space between them. "This is just a contract," she said, her voice unsteady. "You pay me. We cannot do this." "Is that how you want to see it?" Kieran asked, his gaze still intense. "It is how it must be seen," Cass answered, even as her heart screamed no. "You are a Mafia boss. My father was murdered by the Mafia. This is madness." Kieran studied her for a long moment before nodding. He stepped back and left without saying another word. Cass stood alone in the darkness, her lips still warm from his touch. She wondered if she had just done the right thing, or if she had made the greatest mistake of her life. After that night, the 2 weeks that followed were thick with tension. They made sure to never be alone together. They avoided eye contact that lasted more than a second. But every accidental brush of their hands, every glance that met across the table, filled the air with unspoken words. Cass told herself this was for the best: maintain the distance, remember the contract. But her heart refused to listen. Then Vivian made her move. The annual Mafia Council Gala was being held at a massive estate on Long Island. It was the most important event of the year, a time for bosses to meet, negotiate deals, and show off their power. As Kieran Thorne's wife, Cass had to be there. A stylist had chosen a deep blue gown for her. Her hair was swept up in an elegant style, and a diamond necklace Kieran had left on her vanity rested on her skin. She looked the part of a high society woman. Inside, however, she was still the orphan girl with ripped shoes, fighting to stay standing. The first 2 hours of the evening went by without any problems. Cass remained at Kieran's side, offering polite smiles and nodding at faces she did not know, trying to hide her fear. Then Vivian appeared on a small stage at the far end of the room. She held a champagne flute and smiled like a snake ready to strike. "I am sorry to interrupt this wonderful evening," Vivian announced, her voice carrying over the microphone. "But I have some very important information to share with all of you. It is about Kieran Thorne's new wife." Cass froze in place. Kieran started to move forward, but Vivian was quicker. "Do you know where Cassandra Maroro was living before she moved into Thorn Tower?" Vivian asked, her voice like poisoned honey. "She was in an apartment owned by Harold Novak." "And who is Harold Novak?" "Well, he is just one of Salvatore Vega's most loyal men." A wave of murmurs washed over the room. Suspicious eyes turned to look at Cass. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of hostile stares. "She lived in that apartment for 5 years," Vivian continued, her voice filled with drama. 5 years while Vega had her under surveillance. And then, she suddenly shows up at the Gilded Serpent, gets close to Kieran's daughter, earns his trust, and marries him in a matter of weeks. Does that not seem a little too convenient? Vivian turned and stared directly at Cass, her green eyes as cold as ice. "You are a spy, Cassandra Maroro. Vega planted you here to destroy Kieran Thorne from the inside, and I have the proof." She held up a folder and threw it onto the floor at Cass's feet. Papers scattered everywhere. There were photos of Cass's old apartment building and records on Novak. There were logs of Novak's reports to Vega. "That is not true," Cass cried out, her voice breaking with desperation. "I do not know who Novak is. I was just renting his apartment. I know nothing about Vega." But nobody was listening. The room was now filled with suspicion and scorn. Even Declan watched her with caution, his hand already on his weapon. Cass looked to Kieran, desperate to find trust in his eyes, searching for someone to believe her. He stood there, his face a blank mask, his gray eyes impossible to read. In that moment, Cass felt her heart break into a million pieces. "Kieran," she whispered. He did not reply. He looked at her for a long second, then turned to Declan. "Find Novak. Bring him to the basement, now!" Then he walked away, leaving Cass to face the whispers and pointing fingers all alone. She had never felt so abandoned. 3 hours later, Harold Novak knelt on the cold concrete floor in the basement of Thorn Tower, blood dripping from his nose and mouth. Kieran stood over him with his sleeves rolled up, his forearms splattered with blood. Declan watched in silence from the corner. "I will ask you one last time," Kieran said, his voice cold. "Did she know?" Novak coughed up blood and trembled. "No, she did not know anything. I swear it. Vega ordered me to watch her after she left the orphanage. I was only supposed to report on her life and make sure she stayed in the city. She never knew." "Why was Vega so interested in her?" Kieran demanded. Novak paused. Kieran hit him again. "Why?" "Because of her father," Novak screamed. "Thomas Maroro. He was the police officer who gathered all the evidence against Vega 18 years ago. Vega killed him but could never find that evidence. He thought Maroro might have hidden it somewhere. He believed his daughter might know where, so he had her watched her entire life, waiting for her to lead him to it." Kieran became completely still. Cass had been watched for 18 years and had no idea. Her life was not a series of random events. It was a game being played on a board she never knew existed. "She is innocent," Kieran stated. It was not a question. It was a declaration. Innocent. Novak nodded his head quickly. "She is just a girl trying to get by. She knows nothing about Vega, or about me, or about any of this." Kieran turned and walked out of the basement. He needed to find Cass. He had to tell her that he believed her. He had to hold her in his arms and promise her that everything was going to be okay. But when he got to her room, the door was open and she was gone. Cass was curled up in a corner of Maisie's room, holding the sleeping child while silent tears streamed down her face. He walked in and knelt down in front of her. "I know the truth now," Kieran said gently. "You are innocent. You are a victim. Your entire life, you have been a victim." Cass looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. "My whole life," she whispered, her voice broken. "My entire life has been a lie. I thought I was free, but I never was." Kieran took her hand and squeezed it tightly. "I will burn Vega's world to the ground for what he did to you. I swear it." After that night, Kieran's protection of Cass became almost an obsession. He doubled the number of guards around her, refused to let her go anywhere by herself, and started spending much more time at home. But there was one meeting he could not miss. The Council of Bosses called for an emergency session in Chicago. They needed to discuss Vivian's accusations and decide the future of their alliance. If Kieran did not show up, they would see it as him admitting he was guilty. He had no choice but to go. On the morning he was set to leave, Kieran stood in the doorway of Maisie's room, watching Cass read a story to her. Cass looked up and met his gaze. She could see the deep worry in his gray eyes. "I will be back as soon as I can," Kieran said. "Declan will stay here with you and Maisie. Do not leave the penthouse for any reason." Cass nodded. "We will be fine." Kieran paused, then walked over and kissed Maisie on the forehead. The little girl smiled and threw her arms around his neck. Then he looked at Cass, and for a second, she thought he was going to kiss her too. Instead, he just gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze and left. She watched until the elevator doors slid shut, feeling a heavy sense of dread settle in her chest for no reason she could name. That evening went by normally. Cass gave Maisie her dinner, read to her, and they built their usual towel tent. Maisie was asleep by 8, still holding her favorite cloth doll. Cass sat by her bed for a little while, listening to the child's steady breathing before going back to her own room. She did not know that those were her last few minutes of peace before the storm hit. At 10 o'clock that night, the security system in Thorn Tower went dead. The lights flickered and then went out. The cameras stopped recording. All the electronic locks disengaged. It all happened in 3 seconds. Cass was reading a book when the darkness fell. She jumped out of bed, her survival instincts screaming at her. Something was very wrong. She ran toward Maisie's room, but before she could get there, the elevator doors opened. 5 men dressed in black with their faces covered rushed into the penthouse. Behind them, Vivian walked in wearing a blood-red dress, a poisonous smile on her face. "Good evening, Mrs. Thorne," Vivian said sweetly. "Or should I call you Cassandra, the little orphan girl?" Cass stumbled backward, her eyes darting around for anything she could use as a weapon. "How did you get in here?" Vivian laughed. "Oh, you can thank Rhett for that. He has been on our side from the very beginning. He shut down the entire system for us and made sure Kieran's loyal guards took a nice long nap. Declan was the only problem, but he is busy down in the basement, locked in with a few dead bodies." Cass felt her heart stop. Declan. No. 2 of the men lunged forward and grabbed her. She fought back, kicking and clawing, but they were much too strong. They shoved a gag in her mouth and tied her hands behind her back. "The child," Vivian ordered, pointing toward Maisie's room. "No, no, no!" Cass screamed against the gag, struggling wildly. She watched in horror as one of the men went into Maisie's room and dragged the little girl out. Maisie woke up terrified and started to scream, the high-pitched sound cutting through the darkness. She kicked and scratched at the man, but he just tightened his grip. "God, make her stop," Vivian hissed, covering her ears. "That noise is unbearable." She pulled a syringe filled with clear liquid from her purse and tossed it to Rhett, who stepped out of the shadows with a vicious grin. "Put her to sleep. I cannot stand that sound." Rhett moved toward Maisie with the syringe. Cass fought even harder, trying to scream a warning through the gag. She could not let them hurt Maisie. She could not. Wait, Vivian said, holding up a hand to stop him. She stood over Cass, bending down to look into her eyes with a twisted smile. You know, Cassandra, I have waited a very long time for this. 3 years. For 3 years I pretended to be Kieran Thorne's loving girlfriend, just waiting for my chance to take it all. Then you showed up and destroyed my plan in a single night with a pathetic napkin. She seized Cass's chin, her nails digging deep. But that is all right. The plan just needs a small change. Instead of marrying Kieran to steal his empire, I will just use you and the child to make him give it all to me. Then Vega will handle him. And you? She asked, tilting her head. You will have a very slow and painful end. I will see to it myself. She straightened up and gestured to her men. Take them. And Rhett, if the girl makes noise, use the needle. I do not care. They were dragged into an elevator, forced down to the parking garage, and thrown into a black van. Maisie was still screaming, trying to reach Cass, but the men kept them apart. Through her tears, Cass tried to send a silent promise. I am here. You will be okay. I will protect you even if it costs me my life. The van traveled for almost an hour in total darkness before it finally stopped. They were pulled from the vehicle and forced into a derelict warehouse on the edge of town. A few dim yellow bulbs barely illuminated the cold, damp space. Maisie was no longer screaming, completely spent, but a deep tremor ran through her body. Her eyes were vacant, a sign of the mental retreat Cass recognized with a cold dread. Vivian's voice cut through the air, ordering a man to tie the child to a chair. She then pointed at Cass. Watch the waitress. Make sure she does nothing. They fastened Maisie to a worn wooden chair. The little girl was limp, offering no fight, a doll with its strings cut, staring at nothing. Cass was pushed to the ground opposite her hands still bound but the gag now gone. Vivian sat before them, pulled out a phone and made a call. Her voice was pure triumph when she spoke. Kieran Thorne, I have your wife and daughter. You know what you must do if you ever want to see them again. She ended the call and gave Cass a cruel smile. Now we just have to wait and see if your beloved Kieran is willing to sacrifice his empire for you. Cass gazed at Maisie's empty expression and made a silent vow to get her daughter back, whatever it took. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Cass had lost all track of time inside the grim warehouse, unsure if it had been 1 hour or 3. She knew only that she had to make a move before it was too late. Her eyes scanned the room, absorbing every detail. The space seemed to be a former factory office. A large wooden table in one corner held several liquor bottles and a massive crystal ashtray. Next to them was a silver Zippo lighter. An old brass telescope, likely a forgotten decorative piece, was propped against the far wall. Vivian was in the corner, deep in a phone conversation about transferring funds and assets. Rhett was on guard duty, gun in hand, but his attention was elsewhere, constantly checking his phone. A second man stood near the exit, but he seemed just as bored. Cass's gaze fell on Maisie. The girl was still motionless, but her eyes were no longer blank. She was looking directly at Cass. And in that look, Cass saw one clear thing: trust. Maisie believed Cass would save them, and Cass refused to let her down. For hours, Cass had been secretly grinding the ropes on her wrists against a sharp metal edge on the floor. The fibers were nearly worn through. One hard tug would be enough to break them. She just needed the right opportunity. She looked toward the table by Maisie and gave a subtle nod. Cass had noticed a small red button underneath it. She had no idea what it did, but it resembled an old emergency alarm from the factory. If it was still functional, it could set off the fire system or at least create a loud diversion. Maisie's eyes followed her mother's, landing on the red button. She gave a nearly invisible nod in return. She understood. Vivian finished her call and approached them, her smile dripping with victory. I have good news. Kieran has agreed to everything. He is handing over his entire organization for you two. He is on his way now. She leaned in close to Cass. You see, he truly does love you. It is pathetic. Love is a weakness. Vivian then turned to Rhett. Get ready. The moment Kieran arrives, kill him. Then get rid of these two. No! Cass shrieked, pulling her arms with all her might. The rope gave way. She scrambled toward the table, snatched a bottle, and tossed it high into the air over Rhett's head. He instinctively looked up, giving her a vital second. Cass grabbed the heavy crystal ashtray and threw it with every bit of her strength. It flew with deadly precision, smashing into the bottle in midair. Potent liquor rained down, soaking Rhett from his head to his waist. Cass seized the Zippo, sparked it to life, and threw it. The flame touched the alcohol, and Rhett became a human torch. He howled in agony, stumbling backward as he dropped his weapon and clawed at his burning skin. The sickening smell of scorched flesh filled the air. Now, Maisie, Cass yelled. Maisie acted instantly. She slipped from the chair, dove under the table, and slammed the red button with all the force her small body could manage. A deafening alarm blared. Fire sprinklers erupted, showering the warehouse with water. The guard at the door panicked and ran into the night. Vivian screamed in rage and dove for the fallen pistol. Cass charged, and they slammed into each other on the wet floor. They rolled on the slick concrete, punching and scratching. Vivian was surprisingly strong, fueled by a deranged hatred. She seized a handful of Cass's hair and pulled viciously, pinning her to the ground with hands that closed around her throat. "You worthless waitress!" Vivian shrieked, her face a mask of fury as water streamed down it. "I had it all. I was going to be a queen. You took that from me." Cass could not breathe. She clawed desperately at Vivian's hands, but her grip was like iron. Her vision began to darken as spots danced in front of her eyes. She was dying. Just then, a small shape emerged from behind Vivian. Maisie. The child was holding the heavy brass telescope in both hands. Her face was drenched with sprinkler water and tears, but her expression was harder than any 7-year-old's should be. She made no sound. With a surge of strength, she swung the telescope. A loud clang echoed as metal hit bone. The instrument struck the back of Vivian's skull with terrible force. Vivian's eyes rolled back, and her hands fell away. She collapsed, unconscious, as blood began to pool on the floor. Cass lay gasping for air, each breath a painful victory. Every inhale burned her lungs, but she was alive. Maisie let the telescope fall with a clatter. She looked down at her own trembling hands, as if she could not process what she had just done. Cass crawled over to her daughter and hugged her tightly, holding her as if to keep her from disappearing. She pulled out the linen napkin she carried everywhere, the one from that first night at the Gilded Serpent, and draped it over both their heads. "Time for tent," Cass whispered, her voice raw. Under the damp cloth, surrounded by the screaming alarm, the smoke, and the groans of Rhett in the corner, Maisie buried her face in Cass's chest and began to sob. "I was so scared, Mom." "I was too," Cass said, her own tears falling. "But you were so brave. You saved my life." They huddled together under the wet fabric, waiting for rescue from this nightmare. Then gunshots erupted from outside. 1, 2, 3 shots, followed by silence. Cass clutched Maisie even tighter, her heart pounding. She had no idea if it was Vega's men arriving or Kieran's. Her only thought was to protect Maisie. The warehouse door flew open with a deafening crash. Cass shielded her daughter, preparing for the worst. Then she heard his voice. "Cass. Maisie." It was Kieran. She peeked out from under the cloth and saw him in the doorway, a gun in his hand, his shirt stained with blood. His gray eyes swept the room with the fierce intensity of a predator seeking its family. Declan and more guards followed him inside, moving quickly to secure the moaning Rhett and the unconscious Vivian. But Kieran saw none of them. His gaze was fixed on the corner where 2 figures huddled under a wet piece of cloth. He ran to them and fell to his knees, gently lifting the napkin. Maisie looked at her father, her eyes swollen and red. "Dad," she whispered, before dissolving into tears and throwing herself into his arms. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. tears running freely down his own face. For the first time in years, the ruthless crime lord was weeping. Then his eyes found Cass. She was a wreck of bruises, tangled wet hair, and scrapes, but she was breathing. She was there. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Cass wanted to speak but could only nod as her own tears began to fall. Kieran pulled her into the embrace with Maisie, the three of them holding on to one another in the middle of the wreckage. Cass raised the damp cloth and draped it over all of them, a small shelter in a world of chaos. "Time for tent," she said brokenly. Kieran let out a tearful laugh. "You are unbelievable," he said. "Absolutely unbelievable." "I told you," Cass answered with a weary smile. "I have been through hell. I can get through anything." Maisie looked up, her face still tear-streaked. "I hit the demon lady," she announced with a touch of pride. "With the long tube." Kieran's eyes moved from Vivian's still form to the telescope on the floor, then back to his daughter in awe. "My daughter took out Vivian Ashford with a telescope," he murmured. "You saved Mom," Maisie stated simply. Kieran looked at Cass, his gray eyes filled with a love and gratitude that needed no words. In his gaze was a silent vow that he would never allow this to happen again. "It is over," Kieran said, his arms around the only two people who mattered. "It is finally over." And there, beneath the damp cloth in the middle of all that ruin, Cass let herself believe him. The criminal underworld does not use public courts or defense attorneys. It has no lengthy trials bogged down by procedure. It has its own justice, delivered in a dark room below an abandoned Brooklyn hotel where a council of bosses decides the fate of Vivian Ashford, or rather, Tessa Brennan. They brought her in wearing cuffs, her face bruised from where Maisie's telescope had connected. The cruelty was gone from her green eyes, replaced now by raw terror, as she understood there was no escape. The case against her was laid out. The false identity, the alliance with Vega, the kidnapping, the conspiracy to murder. Each charge was like another nail hammered into her coffin, sealing her fate for good. Vivian tried to defend herself. She tried to blame others and make a deal, but no one was listening. In their world, betrayal was the one sin that could not be forgiven. The council cast its vote. The decision was unanimous. Tessa Brennan was stripped of her wealth, branded a traitor, and banished from the United States. They warned her that if she ever came back, she would be met with death. They forced her onto a private plane and abandoned her in Brazil with only the clothes she was wearing. 10 months later, a news report stated that a woman named Tessa Brennan was arrested in Sao Paulo. She had been caught trying to scam a rich businessman. Her sentence was 25 years in one of the worst prisons in Brazil. Justice can be slow, but it always arrives. Rhett Calloway was not so lucky. The burns he suffered that night were too grave. He died in the hospital 3 days after his arrest. He never revealed any useful information, but Kieran did not need him to. He knew enough already. 2 weeks after Vivian's sentence, Kieran called his most trusted men. This was not for business. This was a call to war. Salvatore Vega had toyed with Kieran for the last time. He put a spy inside Kieran's home. He almost took the lives of Kieran's wife and daughter. And 18 years ago, he had murdered Cassandra's father. It was time for it to end. The assault happened on a night with no moon. Kieran led the charge with Declan by his side and 50 soldiers behind them. They descended on Vega's compound in New Jersey, a fortress that everyone thought was impenetrable. They were mistaken. The fight was over in 45 minutes. Blood covered the ground. The air filled with gunfire. Men died. But as the sun came up, Kieran Thorne was the one left standing. Salvatore Vega was at his feet, dead. 3 bullets were in his chest, the same way he had killed Thomas Marrow 18 years ago. Justice. Cass was not there. She was at home with Maisie, sick with fear. When Kieran came back the next morning, his shirt was stained with blood and his face was bruised, but he was alive. She ran into his arms and held on tight, afraid to let go. "It is done," Kieran said, his voice full of exhaustion and relief. Vega is dead. Your father is avenged. Cass did not say a word. She just wept, letting go of the tears she had held inside for 18 years. She wept for her father, for her mother, and for the 10-year-old girl who had lost her whole world. And she wept because someone had finally cared enough to fight for them. Before they went home, Kieran gave Cass a small, worn book. He told her quietly they had found Marcus Webb in a town by the sea. They recovered every penny of the $80,000 he had stolen. The man would never be a danger to her again. Kieran's tone was cold and absolute, erasing the final ghost from Cass's past. A week after the attack, Kieran called the council together again. This time, it was not to pass judgment, but to make a declaration. I am getting out of all illegal business, Kieran announced to the most powerful men on the East Coast. The Thorn Empire is going legitimate. We will focus on property, investments, and charity. No more narcotics, no more weapons, no more killing. The room went quiet. Some men shot each other doubtful looks. One older member got to his feet, his face red. Thorn, you cannot do this. It will make all of us weak. I can, Kieran interrupted, his voice like ice. And I am. Anyone who supports this can stay and work with me. Anyone who does not can get up and leave now. He scanned the room, his gray eyes a clear threat. But just remember, Vega also thought he could challenge me. Not one person spoke. Not one person moved. And that was how Kieran Thorne started to build a new legacy. He was not using blood and bullets, but making the right choices for the family he loved. 2 months went by after Vega's death. Cass lived in a kind of peace she had never experienced in her 28 years. No more dangers hiding in the dark. No more enemies tracking her. Vivian was in a prison in Brazil. Vega was gone. And Thorn Tower finally, truly felt like a home. But that was the very reason Cass had to leave. She stood in her room with a small suitcase on her bed, folding her clothes carefully. She left behind the expensive dresses Kieran bought for her. She packed only the things she had arrived with, her old worn clothes and the frayed linen napkin. She also packed the very first picture Maisie ever drew for her. It showed 2 stick people holding an umbrella over a dragon. The contract was finished. It had actually been finished for a long time. 6 months had gone by, twice the original agreement, and Cass had no more reason to be there. The threat was gone. Kieran did not need a pretend wife to fool the council any longer. Maisie was doing so much better and now needed a real teacher, someone with licenses and experience, not an orphan girl with just a high school diploma and street smarts. She had to go. She knew she had to go, because if she stayed even one more day, she would lose the strength to ever walk away. Declan said, "You hired a moving company." Kieran's voice came from the doorway, and Cass jumped. She turned to see him leaning there. His gray eyes were locked on her, holding an expression she was afraid to understand. He was not in his normal suit. He wore a white shirt with no tie, the sleeves pushed up his arms. He looked weary, but also more calm than she had ever seen him, as if a great burden had finally been taken from him. Cass fought to control her voice, but her heart was pounding. "Kieran, it is over," she said. "The threat is gone. You no longer need me to protect you. Maisie deserves a proper tutor, someone with credentials." Kieran entered the room, his voice sharp. "Not you? You were the one who rescued my daughter at that restaurant. You taught her how to believe in people again. You threw yourself in front of a speeding car for her. You fought Vivian with whatever you could grab to keep her safe." Cass turned away, avoiding his gaze. "It was a business deal. You required security. I required funds for Theo. Our agreement is finished." "The agreement was for 6 months," Kieran countered, closing the distance between them. "You have been with us for nearly a year." "I have overstayed," she said, grabbing her luggage. "I am returning to Queens to complete my nursing studies. It is the best choice for all of us." She attempted to move by him, but he stood in her way. He lifted the suitcase from her grip and placed it down. "I got rid of the old council," he stated abruptly. Cass stood motionless, completely stunned. "What? The council that cared only for its image? The one that viewed Maisie as a problem to conceal? I removed them. I am building a new organization, something honest. I want to focus on what is important. He produced a folded drawing from his pocket. Maisie made this for you. Cass's hands trembled as she took it. She opened it to a child's simple crayon picture. It showed three people: a tall figure with dark hair, a shorter one with long dark hair, and a small child with curls. A blue umbrella protected them, and above it shone a bright yellow sun. Below the drawing, a child's handwriting spelled a single word: family. Tears streamed down Cass's face. Kieran, I cannot do this. The rumors will start. They will call me a fortune hunter, just like Vivian. They will say I trapped you. Let them, Kieran said. He moved nearer and cupped her face in his hands. Let them gossip while we build our life. The world outside means nothing to me, Cass. What matters is that this house felt empty before you came. What matters is my daughter called no one mom for 7 years, until you. What matters is that I wake up each day wanting to see your face. His tone grew quiet, filled with unspoken emotion. If you go, this house will become dark again. I do not think I can survive that darkness a second time. Cass stared into his gray eyes. They were no longer cold, but warm with honesty. She weighed every reason to walk away: their pasts, their differences, the public judgment. Then she remembered Maisie's voice calling her mom. She recalled their makeshift tents and the feeling of security with Kieran. This was the home she never had. I do not want the light to go out either, she whispered. He leaned in and their lips met. It was not a hurried kiss, but a slow, profound promise. It was the kiss of a man offering his whole heart. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads rested together. Do not leave, Kieran whispered. Stay here with Maisie, with us. Cass glanced at the drawing in her hand. 3 small figures sheltered together. She had her answer. Okay, she exhaled. I will stay. 5 years passed. A Forbes magazine cover story read, A New Legacy, Kieran and Cassandra Thorne revolutionize autism support. The photo showed 3 people in front of a new center, smiling and holding hands. But Cass ignored the magazine. She stood on a balcony at their Hamptons home, watching the ocean sparkle in the sun. She listened to the waves and felt the sea air. Her entire world was different. She and Kieran were married in a quiet ceremony. 3 years ago, she had legally adopted Maisie, making their family official. She even started the Morrow Thorne Foundation, an organization that helps children with sensory disorders. The door swung open and a 12-year-old girl appeared, wearing headphones and a brilliant smile. Maisie was thriving. Some days were still hard, when the noise of the world was too much and she needed the safety of her towel tent. But she learned to manage her challenges, transforming what felt like a weakness into her greatest strength. I got into the STEM program, Mom, Maisie announced, waving the acceptance letter. They think I have a gift for coding. Cass's face lit up as she pulled her daughter close. I knew you would. You are my little genius. Dad is in the kitchen pretending to make pancakes. He is actually just crying, Maisie added with her typical deadpan delivery. Cass laughed and headed inside. There, Kieran fumbled at the stove, trying to flip a pancake while secretly wiping his tears on a dish towel. 5 years had changed him completely. He was still a powerful man, but a deep warmth had replaced his cold exterior. The darkness in his gray eyes had vanished, replaced by a light that shone only for his wife and daughter. Nearby, Theo was stealing blueberries from the counter, looking vibrant and healthy. His surgery 5 years ago had been a perfect success. Now, he was a software engineer with a degree, a great job, and his own place in Manhattan. Yet he came home every single weekend. He returned to his family and to the sister who gave up everything for him. Kieran's eyes met Cass's, and he gave her a smile that was hers alone. She made it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Our girl is in the STEM program. I know, Cass whispered, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head on his back. I am so proud of her. "And I am proud of you," Kieran said, turning to lift her chin and kiss her gently. "You know, you still have to pay for that cashmere sweater you wrecked on our first date," he murmured. "Just add it to my bill," Cass replied. She winked. Maisie entered the kitchen and made a face at her parents hugging. "Can you please not do that in front of me? I am only 12. They all shared a laugh. This was the life they had created together. It was not built on being perfect, but on understanding each other. It was not built on big promises, but on small, quiet moments of support. They discovered that love is not about grand gestures. It is about sitting in silence under a napkin until the world stops feeling so scary. In the end, the waitress with the tired shoes did more than serve a dangerous man. She rescued him, and he rescued her. Together, they forged a new family from the wreckage of their pasts. Their story shows how a single moment of kindness, a little bravery, and a simple napkin can alter destiny. It teaches us that family is not just about blood relatives, but about the people who stay with you when everything else falls apart. And it shows that no matter how deep the wounds, a better future is always possible. All it takes is the courage to open your heart and trust again. If this story of love and second chances touched you, please give it a like and share it with someone you care about. Be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell for more stories that will move you every day. How did this story resonate with you? Was there a time when a small kindness completely changed your path? Have you ever met someone like Cass, who brought light into the shadows of your life? Please tell us your own story in the comments. We truly want to read the experiences that have shaped you. Thank you for being with us through this journey. We hope your own life is filled with health, joy, and peace. Always remember, even in the most difficult times, you are not alone and you are worthy of love. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you for the next story. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons.